Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekend reading report. It's time for my weekend reading report, which doesn't always happen on the weekend, but it is this time. This fantastic program where I talk about all the exciting things that I read during the previous week. And I did read some exciting things, Roger. I read some stuff. Let's talk about that stuff that I read last week. I will break out my list for the 500 book challenge, the never ending challenge, where I have to read 500 books that I own before I'll buy any new ones for myself. And where was I the last time I did this magnificent program? I was halfway through, I believe, book number 293, which was The Great White Space by Basil Copper, which is a cosmic horror novel very much in the tradition of H.P. Lovecraft, but it also takes some influence from H. Rider Haggard and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, in that it's about a journey to a mysterious place where terrifying, awful things are sure to happen. And wouldn't you know it, terrifying and awful things do happen when they get to the mysterious place. The problem with this book, which is what I mentioned last time when I was talking about it, because I think I was like 3/4 of the way through last week when I was talking about this book. The problem is that in the middle of the book, there's this big kind of very slow dead space in the middle of the Great White Space where it just drags. It just drags because you have this journey and Copper gives you every detail of the journey, like every detail practically, when it's really not necessary. And you have a weird horror novel where there's just not enough weird horror stuff happening throughout the book. You know that eventually you'll get there and that terrifying things will happen. You get the sense that that is where this book is leading. And it does go there because when you get to the mysterious place, well, when you first get to the mysterious place, nothing happens for a while. But then finally, horrifying things do indeed happen. And the book actually has quite a good ending. But man, it's rough getting there. It's pretty slow at times. So I can't really recommend the book, even though it has a really great ending, just because it drags. It drags in the middle and there's not enough in there to really justify its length, which is unfortunate because it's a really short book. I read this as an ebook because that's how I have it, but I think in print it's under 200 pages. It's well written, I have to give it that, and I think I have at least one other Basil Copper book as an ebook, and I probably will read that one day. But this book I really can't recommend because even though the ending is great, and it is, and some truly terrifying and horrifying things happen, man, it's rough getting there. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about the Great White Space. But the next book I read, book number 294, was Marchers of Valhalla. And this is a fantastic book. It's one of the Berkeley books that was published in the 1970s that collected Robert E. Howard stories. This one is really, really good. Has a great Ken Kelly cover. This series of books just had awesome covers by Ken Kelly. And this is a really interesting selection of stories from Robert E. Howard. Only one of these stories was published during his lifetime. And the quality varies, but they're all at least interesting, and a few of them are legitimately great. So let's take a look at the table of contents. It starts off with The Gray God Passes, which is a story that I talked about fairly recently because it was adapted into a comic book story, a Conan story for Marvel's Conan the Barbarian comic in the 1970s. I talked about that recently on an Epic Comic Book Wednesday. The original story is fantastic. Just a really great, dark fantasy story. It's an historical fantasy. It is not a Conan story at all. It's an historical fantasy and it's excellent. It was reprinted in The Best of Robert E. Howard from Del Rey Books, the first volume of that, I believe. So you could find it fairly easily. I don't know if it's on Project Gutenberg or not, but it's excellent. Marchers of Valhalla, excuse me, The Great God Passes. That's followed by a story called The Thunder of Trumpets, which is an interesting story. It was co-written by Frank Thurston Torbett. And I don't know if he came up with the plot or if Robert E. Howard did. But A Thunder of Trumpets is interesting because it is actually a romance. It's a romance, which takes place in India. It's a fantasy romance because it involves an Indian magician who is immortal. He's immortal, but he falls in love, which causes him all sorts of problems. And it's actually pretty good. It's a definite change of pace for Robert E. Howard, but it's pretty good. This one was not published during his lifetime, but it was published in Weird Tales, I believe. Let me double check. Yeah, it was published by Weird Tales in September 1938. So that's followed by Marchers of Valhalla, which is a James Allison story. James Allison was a guy that could remember past lives. And he remembers a past life in this story. He actually meets a young woman who helps him remember this past life. And it's excellent. Marchers of Valhalla is most certainly the best story in this book. I think it's been reprinted in a new volume from the Robert E. Howard Foundation Press called Swords of the North, which I highly recommend. It's just a great, epic story, which takes place in Texas, a Viking horde in Texas, which finds a mysterious city, and it's awesome. It's absolutely awesome. And this cover illustration is from that story. So yeah, Marches of Valhalla is fantastic. You should read that story. Then that is followed by a couple of horror stories, Sea Curse and Out of the Deep. Those are both pretty good. They're pretty good Jack London-y stories. They have a Jack London feel to me, even though they're supernatural horror stories. They're both quite good. Then you've got The Thunder Rider, which is another story where you have a man in the modern world who's remembering a past life. And this time he's remembering a life as a great Native American warrior. This is an interesting story. It has an odd pace. It takes a while to actually get to the story. The more interesting part is how he goes about remembering his past life. He has to go through a very kind of ghastly Native American ritual to do it. And that part is really interesting. The story itself, when it finally gets to the story, feels like almost a second-rate Conan story, in that the actual story is okay. It feels very typical, a typical Weird Tales story, kind of a lower-end Conan story, but without Conan. But leading up to that, it's excellent. So it's kind of an interesting curiosity, that particular story. Again, never published during his lifetime. Then we have For the Love of Barbara Allen, which is a supernatural story. Not really a past life story, but, well, it kind of is, where a man goes back in time and remembers an incident from a previous life, and then goes and visits the woman that he was in love with during the previous life, and she's an old woman passing away at this time. It's interesting. It's an interesting story. It's not bad. And then this book closes out with The Valley of the Lost, which I thought was great. It's such a pulpy horror story that has so many elements of of different Robert E. Howard stories. You have this ghastly tribe of underground creatures who live beneath the earth, but it takes place in Texas and involves a feud, a generational feud between these two Texas families. And one family has been pretty much wiped out, and you have one guy left who wants revenge. But you also have these monsters that live beneath the earth that become involved. And you also have a journey beneath the earth, this subterranean journey. And you have something that happens in a lot of Robert E. Howard stories where our main character gets a vision, either a vision or a dream, where he gets the history of the ghastly beings that he is facing. This happened a couple times in Robert E. Howard, and it happens here. And it's just a tremendously entertaining horror story, Valley of the Lost. And it's one I hadn't read for a long, long time. It's been a long time since I've read this book. If you ever see this lying around, pick it up. You probably won't find it for $1 like I did. But it's an excellent book. All of these Berkeley books from the 1970s are worth picking up. They're all great. So there was that. That was book 294, which brings me to book 295, which was this one, After Doomsday. After Doomsday. This is from Poul Anderson, a science fiction novel from Poul Anderson, which does take place after Doomsday. So we have a starship full of Earthmen. They're all men on this starship. They've come back to Earth after a couple of years and find that the Earth has been destroyed. It's still there, but the surface has been completely wiped out. It's a dead planet now. And so they freak out, as you would expect. And this becomes a kind of mystery novel in that you have to find out who destroyed the Earth. And there are a few different suspects, because in this story, there are a lot of different aliens, intergalactic civilizations that have contacted the Earth. And so it's kind of Star Trek-y in that way, in that, you know, all of these different civilizations have had previous contact. And there are three main suspects, three main civilizations that you think might have done it. And so you have to go through the whole book to find out who did it. And then you find out, but it's not really, or was it? And it's that kind of thing. There's also a starship full of Earth females, how convenient, that have also avoided the destruction of the Earth. And so the men in the men's spaceship have to find the women in the women's spaceship. And there are probably other spaceships out there from Earth, but whether they'll ever find each other is another thing. It's actually quite good. It's not the best Poul Anderson book I've ever read, but it's a fast-paced, episodic kind of science fiction novel where you always have this tension about, you know, who did it. And every time they contact or get involved with a different alien culture, they're wondering, okay, are these the guys that destroyed the Earth? It's highly entertaining, and it's not a book I've ever heard much about. After Doomsday by Poul Anderson. Anderson has done he's written some great books. This is certainly not his best, but it's highly entertaining. It's one of those books that if you ever find it lying around, definitely pick it up, because it's worth reading. And look at that magnificent cover. How can you go wrong when you have a cover like that? You can't. You just can't possibly. So yeah, this was a lot of fun. After Doomsday by Poul Anderson. That was awesome. Okay, and so, you know, every week I also read comics. And that includes Superman, because I was reading Superman every day. But horror of horrors, there was a day where I missed reading Superman. I just got caught up doing too many other things. So there was a day where I didn't read Superman. So that made me think, you know, I should put this down. So I put this down only temporarily. I'm at this issue because Superman is still lost in space at this time, having adventures. So I put that down because I am behind on reading the Fantastic Four. And so I finished this book. This is book 296. This is Fantastic Four, the new Fantastic Four, which has issues of the Fantastic Four from 1990 to 1992. It is Epic Collection Volume 21 of the Fantastic Four. So I am reading every issue of the Fantastic Four from the first run of the Fantastic Four, which ran from 1961, I think, if I'm remembering right, to 1996. And then it was canceled and brought right back. And I've been behind. I've been way behind on the Fantastic Four. So I thought, I'll stop reading every other comic booky thing I'm reading until I catch up to where I want to be. And so I finished this book. And this had Walter Simonson's run on Fantastic Four, which was a lot of fun. I could tell that Simonson had a lot of fun on this book. He didn't take it tremendously seriously, but he had fun. And so it was a fun run. Didn't stay on Fantastic Four very long. And then he left the book, and Tom DeFalco started to write the book, and Paul Ryan started to illustrate the book. And it is right around here that I first started reading the Fantastic Four again, because I had put the Fantastic Four down because it started to suck for a while, and I've talked a lot about that. But I picked it up again when it got to the 30th anniversary issue. And I continued to read it until it was canceled. And the cancellation really pissed me off because it actually was a pretty good run of the Fantastic Four that I enjoyed quite a bit. It had some rocky moments, but here we find out that Alicia, who married Johnny, the Human Torch, after being the Thing's girlfriend forever, turns out to be a Skrull. She was really a Skrull who replaced the real Alicia, which makes sense. That made sense. It never made sense to me that Alicia would marry Johnny. That was just ridiculous. So, yeah, she was a Skrull the whole time. So this run was interesting. So I read this, and now I'm reading the next volume, which is this one. So it does have its odd moments, including this costume that the Invisible Woman gives herself. This is the period where it's the 90s, of course. So she comes up with this bizarre super MILF costume that she wears for a while. So it has some interesting moments, but altogether, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed this run. And I think Ryan is an underrated artist. I always enjoyed his work on the Fantastic Four. Here we have two different versions of the Thing fighting each other. And Ryan lasted a long, long time on this book. He had a fairly long run in the 90s. So, yeah, he went from 1992 to 1996, drawing the book. This period, it has its ups and downs. This is the period also where there was also a second Fantastic Four series called Fantastic Four Unlimited, which was ghastly. And you see a little bit of that in this Fantastic Four annual, where Herb Trimpe, who was a Hulk artist for years, does the art, and he had transformed his artistic style to some really bizarre 90s style, which is just so freakishly weird. So Herb Trimpe, who was not always the best artist in the world, became super weird when he was doing the Fantastic Four. I've noticed that Fantastic Four Unlimited has not been reprinted in the Epic collections. They left those out, understandably, because they were so ghastly and strange. But I do have them, so I probably will read them just to torture myself. So yeah, that was the Fantastic Four, the new Fantastic Four. That was book 296. And that brings me to book 297, which I just finished, which is this issue of Weird Tales, which was kindly sent to me by Grammaticus. Grammaticus sent me this. So I read the couple issues of Weird Tales before this because they had the first two parts of the Vampire Master, a 4-part novel written by Edmund Hamilton. So part 3 is in this. And I've decided I'm enjoying reading Weird Tales so much that I'm just going to continue to read Weird Tales because it's a lot of fun. And this issue was really, really good. So let's get into the details of this issue. This is December 1933. Has this awesome Margaret Brundage cover. Not her best cover, but it's pretty good. And it's just fantastic to actually own a Weird Tales issue with a Brundage cover. This is actually the only original Weird Tales issue I own. So thanks again, Mighty Grammaticus, for sending that to me. So in this issue of Weird Tales, December 1933, it's packed with some really good stuff. Starting with King Cobra by Joseph L. Kesselring. King Cobra, this is a very pulpy story with a nasty, sneering pulp villain who's in love with king cobras, and it's full of ghastly horrors and villainy. It's a fun pulp story. King Cobra by Kesselring. Then we have Red Gauntlets of Zernai, a Seabury Quinn Jules de Grandin story, which is very appropriate for occult Detective October, which is happening right now. Seabury Quinn's Jules de Grandin is my favorite occult detective. And this is a really good Jules de Grandin story. It has some ghastliness, gruesome ghastliness, which you come to expect in Jules de Grandin stories after a while. And this one is actually quite good. The Red Gauntlets of Zernai. I'm not sure. It's one of those. This was excellent. This is followed by The Ox Cart by Frank Owen, which is a decent supernatural story, which I think it must be the story that was depicted on the cover, although inaccurately. This is about a guy in China who runs across a fella who's immortal and can go into his past and tries to go into his past to change his past, and how the main character becomes involved in this. And it's decent. It's a decent story. Then we get Abdulma, Lord of Fire by Gigi Pendarves. This is another very pulpy story about an evil wizard, another immortal evil wizard. This guy is really evil. And he survives through the centuries by stealing people's souls. Will he continue to steal people's souls? Well, who knows? You have to read the story. Abdulma, Lord of Fire. That is followed by what is the best story in the issue, which is Old Garfield's Heart by Robert E. Howard. This story, tucked away into the middle of the issue, no illustrations for this story, is actually a very good horror story. A thoughtful, interesting horror story, which takes place in Texas. It's excellent, and like I said, the best thing in the issue. Although it's kind of tucked away here, like again, with no illustrations or anything, which I think it deserved. I do think this is the best story in the issue. That is followed by a story that's really, really good, Monkeys by E.F. Benson. This is an excellent story about this doctor who experiments on animals. And he thinks it's worth causing these animals suffering because it'll help human beings in the long run. But he's just going to get his after a while. And it's basically a Pharaoh's curse kind of story. It's an Egyptian curse. And he becomes cursed. And the story is really, really good. Has a very abrupt ending, and it has exactly the ending you expect to happen. But still excellent story. Monkeys by E.F. Benson. That is followed by The Vampire Master Part 3 by Edmund Hamilton. This story by Edmund Hamilton, where he used a pseudonym, he rips off Dracula for everything he could rip off, and then adds, I mean, it's like Dracula on steroids. It takes place in America, but we have a vampire master who's creating all of these different vampires. Unfortunately, the vampire hunters who go after this particular vampire are not nearly as competent as Van Helsing and his band in Dracula. So they're having a harder time getting rid of this vampire. And it's a lot of fun. This has been a lot of fun, this story, The Vampire Master. I don't know where it's been. I know it's been reprinted at least once. But it seems to be a hard story to find outside of these old issues of Weird Tales. But it's worth hunting down if you can. It's a lot of fun. The Vampire Master by Edmund Hamilton. This is part 3, but there is a part 4. So I will read the next issue, January 1934 issue of Weird Tales. And we'll get the close of that story. The next story is The Closed Door by Harold Ward. Decent story, kind of forgettable, but decent. Then we get an interesting story. This is The Lady in Grey by Donald Wandrei, who packs all kinds of weirdness into this story. The plot of this story is not much. It's just there. But there's all kinds of bizarre, horrifying imagery. This is, I guess, would qualify as a Cthulhu mythos story because he adds references to H.P. Lovecraft stories, including The Call of Cthulhu, which he mentions by name. It's not great, but it's so full of weirdness that I really enjoyed it. So Donald Wandrei's The Lady in Grey, that was good. Followed by The Secret of the Growing Gold. This is a Weird Tales reprint, which reprints an old Bram Stoker story, which is not Bram Stoker's best story. It's kind of ridiculous, but not bad. Not bad. Like I said, it has an element of goofiness to it, but not bad. It reminds me very much of kind of an EC horror story from like the EC comics from the 1950s. They could have adapted this story quite well. So that was this issue of Weird Tales, and I loved it. It was a lot of fun. Better than the previous issue of Weird Tales. Not as good as the October issue of Weird Tales, October 1933. But excellent. Full of excellent stuff. So that was awesome. So now I am reading book number 298, which is The Hour of the Oxford Dead by Charles L. Grant. I mentioned the other day how I wanted to revisit Charles L. Grant, who was a writer of quiet horror in the 1970s and the 1980s and into the 90s. I think did he pass away in the 90s? I can't remember when he passed away. But he was one of those writers who you would find his books a lot in the 1980s. He also did a lot of anthologies, which were really good. But it's been a long time since I've read any of his stuff. And this book, The Hour of the Oxford Dead, is not his first novel, but I think it was his first successful horror novel. And it was the first in the Oxford Station series of books, which is kind of Oxford Station is a place where these horror stories happen. So it's kind of a loose series of books. And I'm only a chapter and a half into this book, but so far, pretty good. Starts off with a terrifying murder, and there seems to be either a serial killer out there on the loose in Oxford Station or something even worse. So I have to read the book to find out. But it's starting off pretty good. So I will tell you more about this book, The Hour of the Oxford Dead by Charles L. Grant, next week. So far, so good. So that's that. I think that's everything. Roger. which is good because I've gone on for half an hour. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.